Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for our June webinar from the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. My name is Nicole Leggett, and I'm joining you today from the Boorloo campus on Bojang Noongar Budja. Please can I extend my elders, extend acknowledgement to elders past, present and emerging of the lands that we're meeting on today. I've got two of my managers joining us today to provide part of the update. I have Amanda Fennell, who was leading and is leading the task force work and the implementation of the Family and Domestic Violence System Reform Plan. And I also have Emma Roscoe with me, who is leading the implementation related to the November funding announcements of 72.6 million, and will also have a role in some of the implementation work related to funding that came out of the April budget announcements. So Amanda and Emma will speak to parts of the webinar today. But in addition to providing the acknowledgement of country, I also wanted to acknowledge that we're bringing this webinar to you today in the wake of what has been horrible and devastating homicides, murders of women over the last 2 weeks in Western Australia. And I really just wanted to acknowledge that it's something that has been sitting very heavily with me. I'm sure it's been sitting very heavily with my team, and I doubt it's sitting with all of you in the same way. It is, I can't think of any other way to describe it other than completely devastating. And although I know that this is the reality and the harm to women is the reality of the work that we're dealing with every day, the last few weeks have been particularly difficult. So I really just wanted to acknowledge not only that feeling, but also the incredible work of everyone to persevere, even in spite of these horrible deaths and the grief that comes in the wake of that. So perhaps if I can get the team to move to just the next slide. So what we're going to talk about today is following on from our last webinar, provide a little bit of an update on what's happening in respect of the Family and Domestic Violence System Reform Plan. So what we committed to at the last webinar was coming back at this particular at this next webinar and talking about the governance arrangements and what that would look like. So we have an update for you around that today, and that will include the steps that we've taken so far and what you can expect to see from us over the next few weeks. And we'll also provide you with an update on progress of implementing the investment, and that's the update that Emma will provide. And as always, there'll be time for question and answers at the end. Please post your questions in the chat as we go, and as we normally do, we'll work through those questions and get to as many as we can within the time allocated. If we don't get to all of the questions, then we'll provide written answers after the webinar. So please don't hesitate to pop your questions in, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So I guess moving along, I might speak to the next slide and then I'll hand over to Amanda to do the governance. So this will be a little bit repetitive for those of you who joined us at the last webinar, but I think it's just important to recover the scope and focus of the work. So as all of you would know, the government convened a Family and Domestic Violence Task Force between September and March. So the task force operated for a period of 7 months, and in that time they met on 6 occasions. They had a brief from government to do 3 things quite specifically, which related to the key asks arising from the Family and Domestic Violence Crisis Talks on the 31st of August. So the brief for the task force was to oversight the design of a model for a lived experience advisory group, to look at targeted investments related to the key asks, and also to look at system reform. And specifically, I mean, I think in large part the way the task force was set up and the way that it was framed at the outset from the key asks and the crisis talks was recognising, as you all do and as we do, that family and domestic violence is an issue that is much bigger than the specialist sector on its own. It's an issue that needs to be owned and shared by all agencies across government, across community sector services, across Aboriginal community controlled organisations, in the private sector and in the community more broadly. So really the intent and purpose of the task force coming together, and in the composition that it was, which included Directors General from all of our key state government agencies that have a service delivery functional responsibility, with key representatives from non-government organisations, including Aboriginal community controlled organisations, was to give an opportunity to focus on what are the things that we can do differently to improve the way that we're responding to family and domestic violence every day in every setting. And that's really been how the system reform plan came to be and how the focus within that plan came to be. So again, I'm repeating myself from the last webinar, but what occurred during that task force included some targeted stakeholder engagement and consultation. So there were 5 Aboriginal family safety workshops and 4 workshops that were dedicated around system reform. In the system reform space, the spread of people that were involved included from government agencies, from community sector services, and from Aboriginal community controlled organisations. And actually the first 2 of those workshops started from a case study and looking at an amalgam of real cases and mapping that case through our current service system and looking at what were the missed opportunities, what were the ways that we could have improved and strengthened that response, and then use that as a way to distill down to themes of focus and actions within those themes. And where that left us and where that led us to is a system reform plan that has 17 actions focused across 4 key domains or pillars. And those are relating to workforce development, information sharing, risk assessment, and risk management. I won't read or speak to the goals that's sitting underneath those. You can see them on the screen, but also they're detailed in the reform plan itself, which is available on wa.gov.au website. But essentially, this reform plan, as I said, is about thinking about all the ways that we can make it so that wherever a victim survivor presents in the service system, be that in a mainstream service, a family domestic violence service, or in an allied sector like mental health or alcohol and other drug, that they receive an effective, safe and quality response, and that is a response that is connected to the other key services and agencies, so that we're helping people navigate through that system. So as I said, there's 17 actions that are sitting in that system reform plan, and they speak to a spectrum of activity from, as an example, in the risk assessment space, resetting a standard around risk assessment, so redeveloping the common risk assessment and risk management framework and committing to an agreed benchmark around both the identification of family and domestic violence and the assessment, management and monitoring of risk, through to all the ways that we need to think about how we're embedding that standard in practice across government, across community sector, across Aboriginal community controlled organisations. So each domain has kind of a cascade of action sitting in that space. So at our last webinar, we did talk in a little bit of detail about each of those actions, but what we were probably quite light on with at that stage was talking about the governance and how we would be organising the implementation. So that's what we wanted to come back and talk to you a little bit about today. For that update, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Amanda, who's going to give you a bit of an update on what's happened so far in terms of setting up governance, what we're committed to in that space, as well as what people can expect to see coming over the next few weeks. So Amanda, can I pass over to you, please?
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for that background on the task force and the system reform plan. So I guess really during the development of that system reform plan, the task force turned its attention to the governance arrangements for its implementation. So they really agreed, as you can see from this slide, that for successful implementation of the system reform plan, robust governance was needed, and that should include dedicated implementation oversight group that would be responsible for delivering the reform actions, and that would report directly to the Minister for the Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence, Minister Winton. They also agreed that it should be evidence-informed decision-making, and that was through a combination of data as well as advice and the voices of those with lived experience. That a partnership approach was essential with government, community sector, Aboriginal community controlled organisations and lived experience advocates, and that also essential to that governance arrangement was twice yearly public reporting on progress of that implementation. If we just move to the next slide. So you can see this is the sort of structure, I guess, for the implementation oversight group. This group has been established and did meet for the first time yesterday. So as I mentioned, you can see from the slide that the group reports directly to the Minister for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. The focus of the group is to drive oversight and monitor implementation of the system reform plan to strengthen responses to family and domestic violence in Western Australia. So the group is co-chaired by Mike Rowe, who is the Director General for Department of Communities, alongside Dr. Alison Evans, who you will know is the Chief Executive Officer for the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing. Membership of the group comprises senior representatives from government agencies that were represented on the task force, and you can see those are listed there. So there's 8 members in total, as well as the Department of Communities providing secretariat support to that group. Alongside the government representatives, the group also comprises a number of non-government representatives from peak or representative organisations that have relevant experience or relevant sector membership in the area of family domestic violence. So alongside Dr. Evans, these are the Chief Executive Officer for Stopping Family Violence, the Chief Executive Officer for the Council of Aboriginal Services of WA, the CEO of Aboriginal Family Legal Services, and once established, it will also include an invitation to the chairperson of the Lived Experience Advisory Group. And again, you'll see from the slide to the right is the Lived Experience Advisory Group that will also have a key role once it's established in providing advice and supporting input into the implementation oversight group. If we can just move to the next slide. So the focus of the inaugural meeting yesterday was really to establish the terms of reference for the group and consider the priority pieces of work for the next 12 months. So the group will now commence work to determine detailed implementation approach for the system reform plan. And really key to the implementation approach will be the establishment of a number of working groups that will be convened for specific project deliverables related to the reform plan and those reform actions that Nicole just highlighted. It's anticipated that these groups will be chaired by members of the implementation group. They will comprise representatives from government, community sector, Aboriginal community controlled organisations and people with lived experience. They may be time limited or ongoing. They may use existing structures and they will report through to the implementation oversight group. I guess that's really the overview of where we're currently at. I guess in terms of the next steps, the implementation oversight group is due to meet again in July before moving to biannual or bi-monthly meetings. And the next meeting will really focus on the development of the implementation schedule and finalising that schedule, as well as the establishment of those required working groups. I think at the next webinar, we'll be able to share more about the composition of those working groups, sector engagement, which will obviously be critical in the establishment of the groups and the design of those priority projects that will be listed through the implementation schedule. We'll be able to provide further detail around the implementation schedule and the plan for biannual reporting on implementation progress. So I think essentially that's a kind of quick overview of where we're at, what we're planning to do next. Nicole, I'll pass back to you if there's anything further you wanted to add to that.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for that update. I guess I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Amanda has raised. So we as Amanda said, each of the working groups will be focused on kind of a domain or a program of work, so they won't manage just a single deliverable, if you like. They'll probably manage multiple things at the same time, and that the engagement won't be limited to the working group. So we know that much of this work will require quite detailed and intensive design work with a range of stakeholders, not limited to stakeholders in, for example, community sector. So part of what we'll be able to come back to you about at the next meeting is giving that kind of understanding or idea about how the work might cascade in terms of who's sitting on the governance group, the implementation oversight group, who might be involved and how we might select representation for working groups, and then how that might cascade further into that actual program design work. So to give you a more concrete example of that, in the workforce development space, two of the more immediate things that you'll see progressed are development of the workforce capability framework, which is one of the actions in the reform plan, and design of a dedicated workforce entity or organisation, which is also a key action in the reform plan. Both of those things will require extensive engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, including people who are working in the community sector, working in Aboriginal community controlled organisations, but equally and importantly, people who are expert in this area that might be sitting in academia or in other settings, and or people that are expert in this area working in other jurisdictions. So we're not intending to limit the scope of our engagement. I think the genuine intention is to make sure that we've got opportunity to talk to and hear from and learn from the people who, you know, are most well informed in this space. So when we come back to you at the next meeting, we'll give you an understanding of what that cascade will look like, and therefore what are all the various opportunities for people to be involved. I guess that also raises kind of the flip side risk about how we might think about approaching that work in a way that doesn't create a burden. And I guess what I'm thinking about is that there's quite a significant amount of design work that will be happening over the next 12 months. And we understand and appreciate that people are already working at maximum capacity. They're already working at stretch capacity. We want to be able to create opportunity for involvement in a way that's manageable. So we'll have some discussions, most initially through the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing, and then more widely via this webinar and via other settings with a broader network about how we can think about creating opportunity, but also doing that in a way that isn't kind of excessively burdensome. So we'll be trying to manage a few of those things as we go. The other thing I wanted to signal is there is a box there about reporting and monitoring. So as Amanda said, we have committed, or the government has committed, to twice annual public reporting. The other part is that there will be an impact evaluation of the system reform plan. So we're still in the very early days of working that up as a scope, but that will be something that you'll hear about over the next few months as that gets more developed as to how we might pitch that and how we might position that to get an understanding of how we understand and quantify impact and effect from a focus on systems work that is a little bit different and separate from the work that we're doing to invest in services and create capacity. So that will be another piece that we'll report back to you on, probably not at the next webinar, but sort of in the next quarter. Can I get the team to move to the next slide, please? Just checking where we're at. So I guess just in a nutshell, that is the update around governance that we're going to provide today. So please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. We'll be happy to unpack that further, guided by your questions. And we'll also keep it as a standing item on updates for webinars. I'm now going to hand over to Emma, who's going to give you an update on the investment committed by government in November. And Emma, if I can pass on to you for that.
Thanks, Nicole. Are we able just to move the slides on? No. It's the slide I can have link. It's all right, just keep going, Rach. Don't worry about the next one. Next one, Rach. Okay. So as you're all aware, we had an announcement of $72.6 million in November 2023, and of that there were 15 submissions, and that funding package comprised of just over 13 million for primary prevention and early intervention. So that included the primary prevention grants, Preventing Violence Together, a mass media campaign on family and domestic violence, and also the WA Respectful Relationships Teaching Support Program. There was also 6 million to expand perpetrator interventions, and that included some additional funding for Breathing Space Headland to continue their Breathing Space program, and also 3 men's behaviour change programs, one in Albany, one in Bunbury, and one in Port Hedland. There was also 45 million to expand crisis responses for victims, and that was a continuation of the flexible support package. There was some more funding for Arana's Housing Families First program, some additional funding for Mundamaya, also Rua's 13 safe accommodation units. There's also some funding to upgrade Stirling Women's Centre from 5 communal living rooms to 16 independent units. There's also some funding for Safe at Home, 3 new Safe at Homes, one in Kalgoorlie, one in Kununurra, and one in Port Hedland. There was also 2.5 million for workforce development. So that was a package around coercive control and FDV training for the legal and justice sector. And then there was also just over $6 million for Aboriginal family safety grants. Of that funding, in relation to the current implementation of the 72 million, 4 of the initiatives, so DV Assist, Arana's Housing Families, Mundamaya and PVT, have all been completed and they've been executed. We're currently having direct negotiations with 2 service providers for 2 other initiatives. The primary prevention grants have now closed on Tenders WA and they're currently being evaluated. The Aboriginal family safety grants are still live on Tenders WA and they will be closing on the 2nd of July. We have one of the men's behaviour change program, the one in Bunbury, and that's an expression of interest which is currently on Tenders WA, and that will be closing on the 13th of June. And then we're hoping to get all the 3 Safe at Homes onto Tenders WA later on this month. Next slide, Rach. And obviously to help inform a lot of this investment, we've had multiple direct engagements with service providers. We've held 2 workshops with all the Safe at Home providers, and we've also held 2 workshops, one regionally and one metro for the flexible support package, and that was in March this year. And then there's been a lot of interagency collaboration, and you can see that's with the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Department of Justice, Department of Education, the Australian Independent Schools of WA, and the Catholic Education WA. And currently we're on track to have the majority of this funding out by the end of 2024. That's it from me. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Emma. What Emma has essentially provided is an update on where we're at with the funding that was announced in November, which is very well progressed in terms of its implementation. We are also progressing implementation of the funding announced in April. So what we'll provide at our next webinar is a more stepped update similar to what Emma's just provided, because we'll have basically a plan and a process in place for all of those funding arrangements by the next webinar. For those of you who are working in family and domestic violence response teams, you'll know that we are working on getting that associated funding out the door, particularly for coordinated response services, and we've had a range of different meetings and discussions about that. And in much the same approach, we're talking individually with regions or with providers about particular funding, and that helps us, I guess, square away our procurement approach, which then we'll be happy to share with you at the next webinar. So they were the two things that we had intended to provide an update on today, and understanding we had a lot of questions last time. We've left a good amount of time, I think, for questions today. So please, please put your questions in the chat. And while you are doing that, I might just fill a little bit of time by signalling another area where I think it might be worthwhile providing an update at the next webinar, and that's in relation to the work of National Cabinet. So I think many of you would know that probably 3 weeks ago now, family and domestic violence was elevated to the agenda of National Cabinet. And it is one of the first times that that has happened. I believe it did happen a number of years ago in relation to the first National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, but certainly since the release of the second National Plan, it's the first time that there's been a dedicated discussion in National Cabinet related to family and domestic violence. And what National Cabinet has committed is wanting advice related to 4 specific areas with report backs due in Q3. So the Department of Communities is a little bit on the periphery of this work, being that it is National Cabinet led. There is leadership through different ministerial councils, including the Select Council for Attorney Generals, the Police Ministers meeting, and the Women's Safety Ministers meeting, which we have more direct line of sight of. But they're looking at 4 particular areas. Firstly is a rapid review of prevention effort, and that's being led by the Commissioner for Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, Michaela Cronin, and I think she announced last week the composition of the expert panel who will be doing that rapid review. Second is a body of work to be led through the Select Council of Attorney Generals with support from police ministers, which is about what are some of the things that we can think about doing in relation to high-risk perpetrators that very squarely sit in that legal and justice response. There is a third piece around information sharing, which is being managed through data and digital ministers, which again relates to perpetrators. And there's a fourth piece around national consistency in respect of risk assessment and sexual violence responses. On relation to that one, there will be leadership through South Australia and Victoria, but we don't have detail yet about that scope, and obviously risk assessment and sexual violence response is very broad, so I am hoping that by the time we get to our next webinar we'll have some additional detail to offer about that particular program of work and what that's going to shape up to look like, but that might be something that if there's interest we'll be happy to brief on at the next webinar, just to give you that visibility to those things that are occurring nationally and how they kind of dovetail with the state government work and the system reform plan. So now that I've taken up a little bit of additional time, can I ask Rachel to start reading out questions?
That's okay. I'm going to jump in for you, Nick.
Thanks,
there's actually only one question, and that's, can you please provide an estimated time for the outcome of the prevention grants?
Yeah, thank you. So we are working towards having them awarded in Q3. So we don't want it to take a long time. We know that we've got organisations that had grants that have now ended, and there would be organisations that are submitting to sort of take the next step in relation to that work that they've already done. So we are hoping to have that process finalised in Q3. We did receive a lot of applications, so we are working through them, and we've essentially quarantined some staff to do that. So I can't give you an exact date, but we are trying to get through it as quickly as we can. On the primary prevention work, one thing I just wanted to acknowledge was that in relation to some of those kind of first round projects, we're starting to see products come through, and of what I've seen so far, there's just been some incredible work that's been happening in community, and I wanted to shout out particularly to the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing and congratulate them on release of Foundations for Change, which is a fantastic piece of work, and I think will be of incredible value and benefit for us here in Western Australia and for setting us up for that continued attention to and investment in prevention work. And then, you know, I guess just really shouting out to everyone who had primary prevention grants in the first round and seeing what was done with the money that organisations had, it really is quite incredible. We've been getting a little bit of additional detail from different providers, and it's been, you know, really incredibly valuable and also really inspiring to see how people have taken the work and taken the opportunity through that funding and just, you know, done really incredible things in their communities. So just wanted to kind of shout out to everyone who's working in that space at the moment. Amanda, any other questions?
That's the only question we've got today.
Great. So what I would say is if something comes to you, additional questions, please don't hesitate to email us at the inbox below. As I said, what you can expect from us at the next webinar is some more detail about what that sector engagement piece will look like in respect of system reform plan action. So we'll take it to that next level of detail about working groups and then sector engagement. I'll also provide another update on National Cabinet, and hopefully by then we'll have a little bit more detail about the scope and what those products might actually look like for report back to Cabinet for Q3 of this year. And we will give a bit more of a update and kind of visibility to what that kind of stepped implementation process is going to look like for the funding that was announced in April. So we'll do those 3 things at the next webinar, and then anything in between times, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Sorry, Nicole, we've just had a couple of more questions come through, so I'll just read those.
Thanks.
First one is, we're extremely concerned about the safety and wellbeing of victim survivors in the community that cannot access support. Services and supports are extremely stretched and under-resourced. Is there any urgency or actions being taken on immediate responses or increases in funding for services outside of systems reform?
Thank you for the question. So absolutely. So I guess everything that is committed in terms of funding is in the public domain now. So I think what we talked about at the last webinar and what Emma has foreshadowed in her announcements is that the 169 million includes funding across a continuum. So there's funding for primary prevention, there's funding for service capacity and service response, there's funding for workforce development, and there's funding for system reform. I guess in general terms, the funding allocation for system reform is relatively small compared to the service funding, but I absolutely acknowledge and understand and appreciate that that's not reaching in and providing a level of service that we need across the whole state. So there is no, so that work that we're doing at the moment is to get that money out the door and into the community. You would also be aware, many of you have been in receipt of Commonwealth funding through the National Partnership Agreement for Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence Responses. That's looked like extension on programs to June 25 and administration of contracts for innovative perpetrator response and 50 new family, domestic and sexual violence workers. So they're the other kind of pieces of work that we've been doing in parallel around service capacity. But those things are kind of in train and in the public domain. There's nothing immediately available other than what we have already been talking about.
So there's another question regarding the recently announced family domestic violence frontline workers. Are you able to advise the number of workers allocated across the different national plan areas of action, so prevention, early intervention, response and recovery?
I can't yet because the announcement, so the organisations that are in receipt of those workers are aware, but there is a process where the government would like to make an announcement, and that's something that needs to be coordinated with Minister Rishworth. So until they've made that public announcement, we're limited on what we can say in relation to that scheme. So I'm certainly happy to provide that level of detail, but I can't get in front of that government announcement just at this minute. So we'll be happy to provide that perhaps once that government announcement's been made, then provide that visibility to that next level detail.
And then another question around frontline workers, but specifically around the regions. So although there is a significant investment occurring, there's still lack of funding to increase frontline workers in regional areas. Will this be addressed?
Yeah, so I think what I mean, I think maybe what we can do when we give our next update on the funding is perhaps represent it more like a regional breakdown. So give a bit of a illustration of what's going where. And hopefully by that time we can do that overlay of the National Partnership Agreement funding as well, so that people can see what's going to be landing in their location, you know, which will give a bit of a better sense of where that extra capacity is going to be.
That's all the questions we have now.
Great. Well, as I said, if more questions come through, we'll be happy to provide a written answer and then send that around with the slides. So please don't stop posting your questions in the chat, but we will end the webinar here, and any questions that come through after we've ended, we'll pick up and respond to in writing. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, and look forward to seeing you again next month. But please don't wait. If you've got any questions or you want to talk about something in between time, we'll be happy to have further discussion and take advice about what you want to hear in the webinars as well. Thank you, everyone.